On.
Hello, everyone. I'm Kim Mack. Welcome to the 9th event in the Popular Books in Process series, a collaboration between the Journal of Popular Music Studies, IASPM US, and the POP Conference. As always, thank you to my co-organizers, Eric Weisbart and Carl Wilson. Last week, we had a great conversation between Rebecca Rinsma, Eric Chari, and Kwame Harrison about popular music pedagogy. And next week, on August 25th, Maria Sherman will be discussing her new book, Larger Than Life, A History of Boy Bands from NKOTB to BTS. And in case you're unaware, you can find previous sessions on Eric Weisbart's YouTube channel. Today, we're excited to have Emily J. Lordi here, who will talk about her new Duke University Press book, The Meaning of Soul, Black Music and Resilience Since the 1960s, and she will be in conversation with Regina N. Bradley and Hanif Abdurraqib. Emily J. Lordi is a writer, professor, and cultural critic whose work focuses on African-American literature and Black popular music. She is the author of 3 books, Black Resonance, Iconic Women Singers and African-American Literature, published by Rutgers in 2013, Donny Hathaway Live, a Bloomsbury 33 and a Third book in 2016, and The Meaning of Soul, Black Music and Resilience Since the 1960s, out from Duke this year. In addition to publishing scholarly articles on topics ranging from literary modernism to Beyonce, she contributes freelance essays to such venues as NewYorker.com, NPR, and The Atlantic. She is co-editor with Joshua Clover of the Singles series for Duke University Press, and she's an associate professor of English at Vanderbilt University. Dr. Regina N. Bradley is an alumna, Nasser Jones Hip Hop Fellow at Harvard in spring of 2016, and an assistant professor of English and African Diaspora Studies at Kennesaw State University in Kennesaw, Georgia. Her expertise and research interests include post-civil rights African-American literature, hip-hop culture, race, and the contemporary US South, and sound studies. Dr. Bradley is the author of the forthcoming book, Chronicling Stankonia, The Rise of the Hip-Hop South from UNC Press. Chronicling Stankonia explores how Atlanta, Georgia hip-hop duo Outkast and Southern hip-hop influence in conversations about the Black American South after the Civil Rights Movement. Chronicling Stankonia stems from her critically acclaimed series, Outcasted Conversations, a YouTube dialogue series about the impact of Outkast on popular culture. She's also the editor of a forthcoming collection of essays about Outkast for the University of Georgia Press. In May of 2017, Dr. Bradley delivered a TEDx talk, The Mountaintop Ain't Flat, about the significance of hip hop in bridging the American Black South to the present and future. In May of 2019, Dr. Bradley, along with music and culture journalist Christina Lee, started hosting the Southern hip hop podcast, Bottom of the Map for WABE, that's for NPR Atlanta, and PRX. Bottom of the Map boasts being featured as new and noteworthy on Apple Podcast and 2019 Best New Local Podcast by Atlanta Magazine. Dr. Bradley can be reached via Twitter her handle is @RedClayScholar, and through her website, www.redclayscholar.com. Hanif Abdurkheeb is a poet, essayist, and cultural critic from Columbus, Ohio. His poetry has been published in Muzzle, Vinyl, PEN American, and various other journals. His essays and music criticism have been published in The Fader, Pitchfork, The New Yorker, and The New York Times. His first full-length poetry collection, The Crown Ain't Worth Much, was released in June 2016 from Button Poetry. It was named a finalist for the Eric Hoffer Book Prize and was nominated for a Hurston Wright Legacy Award. With Big Lux, he released a limited edition chapbook, Vintage Sadness, in summer of 2017. His first collection of essays, They Can't Kill Us Until They Kill Us, was released in winter of 2017 by $2 Radio and was named a Book of the Year by BuzzFeed, Esquire, NPR, Oprah Magazine, Paste, CBC, the Los Angeles Review, Pitchfork, and the Chicago Tribune, among others. He released Go Ahead in the Rain, Notes to a Tribe Called Quest with University of Texas Press in February of 2019. The book became a New York Times bestseller and was met with critical acclaim. His second collection of poems, A Fortune for Your Disaster, was released in 2019 from Tin House. He is a graduate of Beechcroft High School. After the discussion, there'll be a Q&A, which Eric Weisbart will moderate. Please put your questions in the chat as they come to you, and Eric will find them there at the end of our discussion. So I will now turn things over to Emily, Regina, and Hanif. Let's please give them a warm welcome.
Sorry. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Kim, Eric, and Carl for making this series happen. And Regina and Hanif, thank you so much for being a part of this. It's an honor to be in conversation with you all about my book and also your books and your work more broadly. So I'm just going to jump right in. I'm going to say a little bit about the book. The structure is such that I'm going to say a little bit about the book. And then we'll have a couple of responses. Hanif's going to go first because he actually has to leave and teach a class at about 30, 40 minutes. And then Regina will kind of weigh in. And then if time permits, I'll ask a question of both of them that kind of connects, I think, some of our shared investments, thematic and formal. And then we'll just do the Q&A, I think. So anyway, we'll see how it goes. Thanks for coming. My book, The Meaning of Soul, was published on Friday, and I'll say a little bit about how it started, the genesis of the project first, which really kind of grew out of my first book, which was an interdisciplinary study looking at Black women singers and African-American writers across the 20th century. That book ended with a comparative analysis of Nikki Giovanni and Aretha Franklin. And for those of you who have written books, you might also find that, or have found that you kind of realize where your heart is sometimes when you get to that last chapter. And that was certainly the case for me, is that I realized that my heart was, as much as I love Ralph Ellison and Gail Jones and Richard Wright and Bessie Smith and Billy and the others, that was sort of where the center of gravity was for me. So it was the sort of impulse to explore soul more, not least because soul has really sort of been understudied, particularly in I should say, the kind of context of African-American literary studies, which is sort of my home base. I'm in an English department, where, in the context of Black studies, we have theorized kind of blues aesthetics and jazz aesthetics and hip hop aesthetics and post-soul aesthetics, right? Which is a way of talking about how certain formal features of the music can also be translated into or understood in literary terms, right? So blues call and response, for instance, gets an analog in the kind of call and response patterns that we can find in various ways in African-American literary form. But people hadn't really talked about soul aesthetics. The musicologists, Portia Maltby and others, had done crucial work in talking about soul aesthetics, but we really hadn't thought about it as a concept that had a sort of aesthetic features and conceptual weight in its own right. On the contrary, and this is the sort of place where the book makes a specifically academic intervention, what we had thought about, again, in a kind of Black literary studies context, was this idea of the post-soul, which figures soul as a kind of nebulous but nefarious foil to the kind of post-soul, post-civil rights Black cultural production that is going to come after soul, right? So soul, put very simply, in those conversations, is never is not really specifically defined, but it is kind of talked about and around as this sort of problematically racially essentialist heteropatriarchal formation associated with sort of worst impulses of Black nationalism that later Black writers, so like born in 1963 and onward, need to contest or kind of get over in some way, right? Move beyond. But the question of what soul actually was and what the people who developed this concept and developed the music that would come to be known as soul, like what they thought they were doing, had gone underexplored in my estimation. So that's really where I took off, as reading Black artists and commentators in the Black press and elsewhere. People like Amiri Baraka are really important. People like Nikki Giovanni, people like Phil Garland, whose name I really can't say enough, who wrote a book called The Sound of Soul in 1969, and is one of the most important commentators and theorists of this formation, this cultural formation, as well as the music. What did they think that they were doing? This is, the archive that I was looking at. And what I concluded, is really that soul was not really so much a thing as it was a logic. that what people were doing they weren't so much identifying or suggesting that there was a kind of essence that sort of bound all Black people together across time, nor was soul simply a genre of music, but it was more of a logic. It was more of a kind of habit of thought that looked at past struggles and historical struggles, as well as kind of daily immediate struggles, as the sort of necessary foundation for something beautiful, for a kind of style and virtuosity and sense of survivorship and belonging that no one else besides Black people could claim. So it was a habit of thought that saw trouble, or labor, or what it was to be the hardest working man in show business, in James Brown's terms, hello R.J. Smith, as really having a kind of payoff, a performative payoff, in the case of music, and a kind of spiritual sense of collective endeavor and endurance, and encouragement in kind of the terms of everyday people. So in other words, the book is trying to offer a very kind of broad-based or a broad overarching definition of soul, as a discourse of Black resilience. And then it's trying to use that in order to perform more kind of fine-grained detailed readings of the musical practices through which Black artists enacted that concept of resilience on a national stage. The last thing that I'll say about the approach that I take in the book, and then I'll sort of turn it over to the others, is just to say that, as many people will be familiar with, the story of soul had largely been told by men, and white men in particular, particularly in kind of the latter part of the 20th century. And so whether that has meant focusing on the contributions of white men, few though they might be, to the music, or focusing on the problematic sort of exploitation of the musicians by the men, right? In a kind of, so the first motto would be exemplified by the documentary Muscle Shoals, which, if those of you who haven't seen it, I don't suggest seeing it, but you can trust me that that documentary really goes the extra mile in trying to find a way to highlight the contributions of white male musicians to the spectacular music that was being created in Muscle Shoals. Whereas the other impost, which is to focus on the kind of problematic relationship or exploitative relationship between Black artists and kind of white industry makers and leaders and executives, would be best exemplified by Nelson George's fabulous book, The Death of Rhythm and Blues, right? So for me, it was important to kind of tell a different story, and particularly as a white critic, to tell a story that was sort of working against that tendency to focus on, like where's the white involvement in this particular kind of formation, and to work again, in not so much the question of what happened to soul or what was it resisting, so much as this question of what were people making under conditions not of their choosing, what were Black women making particularly, right? Because that's the part of the story that hasn't been told. So what were they making, and kind of what did it mean to people within the culture specifically? And that's one thing that I think really does link my work with that of Hanif and also Regina, is that with both of you all, Regina, you in your work on Outcast, for instance, like, it's not that you're not very cognizant of the fact that you are explicitly intervening in a field of Southern studies that has been essentially white Southern studies, but has not marked itself as such, right? But your focus is not so much on how Outcast and the other Black Southern artists that you look at are resisting that at every turn. It's just as much about what people build and make, what Black people make with and for each other, right? And Hanif, likewise, in the book on Tribe, it begins, I was thinking about, these connections, like it does begin with this incredibly efficient and economical kind of story of slavery, but the point is not to focus on that as so much as it is to focus on the drums, the metaphor of the drum, and the idea of what can't be taken away, and what gets made again in spite of these sort of conditions, not just in spite of, but because there's something in Black culture that is always insisting on endurance, possibility, and this kind of collective resilience. So that's sort of what the book is doing, and some ideas about how I think it relates to the work of my esteemed interlocutors, but I'm curious to know what you all would say. I'll mute myself.
Yeah, that was great to hear. And I'm someone who has spent time with the book and really appreciated it, especially because I've been thinking about, though it's more blues and soul, what I've been thinking about. I rewatched the movie Cadillac Records recently, which was a bad decision, but I'm doing a big thing about Little Walter. And it required me to like revisit that scene in Cadillac Records where they like try to cram this entire mythology of Little Walter into the recording of like, it's like a some old like montage bullshit where it's like he's recording My Babe, but he also like shoots someone. He also takes his first drink, and he also, you know, that's how they do. And I was thinking about how so often in these films and in these books that are often like centering the stories of the white folks who are aligning themselves with the music, Black stories are often sped through in that manner, right? They require to be sped through in a manner that allows the focus to return to the white savior or the white window to the outside world. And so I say all that to say I've been sitting with this book and really appreciating the patience within it, particularly because Minnie Riperton's someone who I've been thinking about a lot lately too. And there's that whole section about, I have like multiple monitors, so I'm not like looking randomly out into the void, though that is how I spend most of my days now. But there's that whole section on Minnie Riperton that I thought was just so complex and wonderful. And then it kind of like extends into Solange. And a big thing, this is kind of, maybe this is a question that's really foolish, but I'm so sound driven. You know, I don't have, I just don't have the amount of like education that I think a lot of other people have when it comes to how to articulate things. You know, I didn't go to school to study writing or whatever. So I'm just very sound driven, right? Sound kind of is the bridge I take to the emotions, and through that emotional arrival, I figure out how to say something about something else. And I loved how tenderly and thoughtfully sound was treated throughout the book. And just like a very basic, you write about notes so well. And I was wondering if you had like a favorite note from a Black soul artist that you kind of ruminated on. Like I like a lot of people, I think in my age range, I grew up with parents who loved Minnie Riperton, but never played anything but Loving You, you know what I mean? Or like I never heard those joints. And so like, I grew up thinking only, not even of Minnie Riperton as an artist, but as a person who had not even a song, but a moment within a song, and that was it, right? But I think there's something obviously not great about that, but there's also something kind of wonderful about a note that endures in that way. So I was wondering if you could talk about some of your most beloved single notes.
Wow, that's awesome. Thank you for that. And that's really getting down to the nitty gritty of the sort of detail. Yeah, some favorite notes. It's funny that you should mention that because we were listening to Luther Vandross in the car the other day, and we were listening to A House Is Not a Home, and talking about how that house, the way that he sings house, is like right in the sweet spot. I mean, there's many sweet spots in his voice, but that's one that he could just luxuriate in, you know, but doesn't. Kind of, there's like a pulling back, you know, where like if he wanted to, he could just let that just ride that moment, you know, and really like make a home there, I guess, you know, to put it in a certain kind of way. But I mean, I guess I love those moments where people are like right in that sweet spot and they can do whatever they want, you know, but also where they're kind of reaching. You mean musical notes specifically, right?
Yeah, my bad. I don't include musical notes for sure.
Yeah. I mean, another thing that I think of is like, this is like a little moment that, again, it would be better to listen to it, to actually hear it. But there's a moment in Al Green's rendition of Summertime, which I write about, where he sings one of these mornings, and it's like this, like that's the horn that kind of, you know, works in counterpoint with him. But it's like, it's such a surprising one of these mornings. Like, that's not how that song usually goes. And it's sort of like throwing it out there, you know, and kind of just show, just to, in some ways, to kind of like show us how he can, right, and how he's going to catch it and do all kinds of things with that song. But that would be another kind of note moment. There's finally, the last thing that I'll say, I guess, is more of like a lyrical note combination, but the one that Aretha Franklin performs when she sings Dr. Feelgood, and she has that sitting around in the live performance that Wesley Morris describes so beautifully as like a lit fuse almost. She just like drags that note, that particular like S sound out to an almost painful extent. So that would be one of my favorite notes.
I love all of those, especially the Aretha one. And I think Aretha was someone whose notes I often return to, and I think someone like Whitney with vowels. You know, I love the way Whitney Houston sings vowels. You know, like there's that part of at the end of I Want to Dance with Somebody where it's almost like the Y at the end of somebody connects to the next I, and I Want to Dance with Somebody, and the yeah is almost just like interwoven into the fabric because of the way she kind of ecstatically rushes into it. I don't know. That was my question. Sorry for going very granular early on, but that was the one thing that was on my mind when I was reading like chapters 3 and 4 of the book, where it's just like I would just love to talk about sound and the expression of sound through soul.
Thank you. Regina, did you want to?
Hi. No, I'm over here just taking notes and asking myself questions and feeling more like a student than a scholar in this space. But I love what I've read so far. I'm not gonna lie to you. Kennesaw just started classes yesterday, so I have been I've been trying to be great and balance these things, but I was like, nope, I'm definitely gonna be part of this conversation because I'm super excited about this. So thank you for having me. And hi everybody. Hi, who I can't see. So I've skimmed through the whole book, but I was really kind of stuck on the first 2 chapters because one, I'm thinking about, I was really fascinated by the whole discussion of the new Black aesthetic and what that looks like in terms of gender and race, but I was also thinking about region. You know what I'm saying? You were talking about the impact of Motown, for example, which is duh. But even in my own book, I ask, I'm like, why is Motown always the go-to and not something like Stax, especially for those of us who are in the South? You know what I'm saying? Like I think about, I'm one of those folks who always kind of use a personal memory moment to expand into a larger conversation. And as I was reading this, I was thinking about, well, two memories came to mind. The first memory that came to mind for me was when my grandma told me that Sam Cooke tried to holler. And I was crying laughing because, I was like, what's Sam Cooke doing in Albany in, I can't tell you which decade because I like living, you know what I'm saying? But anyway, she was like, Sam Cooke tried to holler. And I was thinking about like how much emotion was in his voice and all of these things. And I'm like, oh, all these wonderful kind of Southernese experiences that were floating to me as I was reading. But ultimately, the thing I kept coming back to were 2 questions. The first question I was coming back to is the significance of the archive and who reads the archive. Like, that's what immediately came to mind for me because, if you follow what something like Guy Ramsey says in race music, it's a particular type of reservoir of memory. And I'm like, yep, definitely. So one of my immediate questions as somebody who studies, music in the South is that's a lot to work through because you're not just working through the historical context of the song, you're also working through the cultural context of the song, which is tied into how people in the South were always 1 foot in the past, 1 foot in the future, never really in the present. So for the artists that had Southern roots, I'm wondering what role those roots played in how you thought about the articulation of sound that you were presenting, the theorization of it. And then the other part I was thinking about was like, I really enjoyed the falsetto chapter. Like I really was like, yo, because the way that you made it, it made me think about how like the falsetto is an archive in a particular type of way. Like you're paying homage to where that influence is coming from, but you're remixing it to its own package to think through, present your own type of sound. So I'm just kind of curious about what role did region play in how you were theorizing how sound impacted the theorization of soul that you present in the book.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's such a rich question. And I guess one thing to say is it feels like I think because there is a kind of center of gravity in that falsetto chapter that is so much about what happens with Southern artists and at Stax, and it starts with Ann Peebles and goes to Al Green, who's looking at Isaac Hayes before going up to Minnie in Chicago. But I think, you know, one way to address that question is to bring together the interest in falsetto and the interest in region, and to think about how artists are working against in deploying the falsetto, using, you know, with a nod to Sam Cooke in some ways, in that real kind of like almost like crooner balladry that he helps to popularize, but how they're really changing the sound of Southern soul, you know. And if it was often associated with the kind of, you know, the gospel belting charisma, you know, with Sam and Dave or what have you, that Al Green, somebody like Al Green, Isaac Hayes are like very explicit about, like, we have a different sound of Black masculinity, Southern Black masculinity in this moment, and their falsetto, I'm suggesting, like really helps them to articulate that. And it's a call back to, you know, church and in all the different, you know, the range of male voices that you hear there. And it's also a callback, I think, to a certain Southern blues tradition, kind of spooky blues of, you know, somebody like Robert Johnson. And so I think they're kind of working in those traditions in order to articulate a different concept of Black Southern masculinity in that moment, but one that we can hear in Ann Peebles as well, you know, that she's doing something that I wanted to highlight her and start that chapter with her, because it's easy for her to be overshadowed in the history, in the archive, as she was in real life by somebody like Al Green, who comes along and like scores more hits. But her use of falsetto in I Can't Stand the Rain for me was equally important. And I just want to quickly nod to you, because the very idea of, you know, expanding the sound of Southern Black masculinity is largely indebted to the work that you've done with Outkast. So thanks for that. You know, it's sort of like shuttling between time periods, as we do, right? It's like somebody's working.
I mean, you can't get away from it, right? It's like if you study anything in the South, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I'm just like, you can't get away from it. It's like you can't talk about something that's happening in the present and not acknowledge something similar that gave it the fabric to think about it from the past. You know what I mean? Because the thing that I was thinking about with that falsetto chapter, and just in general, was how would you put somebody like Sam Cooke or, you know, all these folks in conversation with somebody like Three Stacks, who, if you listen to like The Love Below, he's all falsetto everything. You don't really get the hip hop that you know, he wants to try out his voice.
Yeah,
he wants to try out his voice. Or even somebody like CeeLo Green. Like CeeLo Green also comes to mind for me, like as part of this lineage that you're mapping out. And I'm just like, there's so many folks that you can kind of connect that to. But the other thing I wanted to ask you about was, let me make sure I get my notes. Okay. The idea that you were talking about, that the misremembering, right, that you talk about of the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 1970s. That was just like the big in my face, like, yes, especially thinking about what's going on now. And you have folks who are trying to romanticize. Like in my notes, I'm like, misremembering equals romanticization. So one of the questions I was thinking about is how do you navigate that idea of misremembering in your analysis of what soul was supposed to be, what it was supposed to be doing, and how do you think we could use that to address, you know, the extension of that music that's used even now, right? Like if you think about the protests that are taking place across the country, across the world, you know, of course you have the go-to hip hop, but you also have a lot of soul that's used, you know, from People Get Ready to, you know, A Change Gonna Come. So I'm just kind of curious about, you know, you said like you said, we're always connecting the past to the present. How are some of the ways that you kind of navigated that? Like, how did you keep yourself on track to be like, nope, I don't need to romanticize this. I need to give this a particular critical approach that is often overlooked in writing about that moment and the effect of that moment in the present?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things. One thing is that I think the tendency, the impulse often has been to kind of romanticize the music, right? And to talk about it as if it kind of like comes from people who aren't really even like, you know, properly like actual like working people, right? Workers, laborers. And that's one incredible contribution of Nikki Giovanni's poem for Aretha, that it's like a signal text that I still return to, is where she just talks about Aretha as a mother of 4 children having to hit the road. And what is it like to not have your toothbrush, and you have to, you know, go to the next stop, and you smell like the bus after a certain, you know, period of time. And it's just like she's saying like precisely because Aretha is like an actual person, her contributions are that much more extraordinary, right? Like we don't have to choose between like, oh my God, the most amazing Queen of Soul Aretha and like the everyday person. But it's actually that the everyday, acknowledging the everydayness of these people, of everybody in the study, you know, as I'm trying to do on some level, actually I think enhances people's appreciation for what they were able to do, again, in spite of, or in the face of some impossible conditions. And one reason for that is because of the communities that they brought with them, right? The everyday people that you might not have seen on stage or in the crew, but that were there, you know, in the wings and in the archives and in people's ears, you know, like as they did their work. So I guess that's one way that I try to very carefully work against the tendency to romanticize these legendary soul artists. In terms of misremembering, I mean, for me, I think soul has been misremembered in part. So if civil rights has been misremembered, like in your account as kind of in this hyper idealized way, I think that soul has often been misremembered in a kind of demonizing way, right? And that's one reason why I should have said earlier, soul aesthetics haven't really been theorized, is I think because they signal a radical moment of revolutionary possibility and activity that the culture at large, the dominant culture, has wanted to repress, right? So there's a sense in which I think in the backlash to that revolution, things start to get reduced. There's a reduction that happens, a simplification that happens that again paints soul as, you know, just kind of this heterosexist, very patriarchal kind of form. And Gail Wald has done work on this. You know, the other people and many other scholars, you know, Margot Crawford is somebody else. I can name several other people who have really worked to flesh out our understanding of civil rights and Black power and Black arts as a much more kind of vibrant, interesting, and complicated formation than some people subsequently had led us to think it was. But that's kind of what misremembering means for me, and the kind of misremembering that I'm trying to work against.
Dope.
Yeah.
I know Hanif has to go teach. I didn't know if he had anything else he wanted. I'm gonna shut up now.
You have to go now.
In like 5 minutes. So if you wanted to, I don't know.
Yeah.
Like 5 minutes.
Can I ask you out both the question that I wanted to ask you has to do with both of your work across genres and the ways that you stretch the work that you do as music writers, right? So within particular discrete works, and then just doing so, I mean, every kind of different, you know, from scholarship and history and memoir and poetry and fiction. And I'm just wondering kind of what that means for you and how that relates to your investment in tradition, I guess, or intergenerational legacy more broadly. Does that make sense as a question?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think about a long time ago, I stopped considering myself as someone who had to be beholden to the idea of genre. And I say that because I come from a family where my father, I think like a lot of Black folks in America, I come from a family of storytellers with not necessarily a wide range of stories. And so I come from a family where my father tells and has told the same 4 stories for most of my life, you know what I mean? But as I have aged and as he has aged, the stories take on a little more flourish in certain spots, or they take on a little more musicality in certain spots, or the imagery becomes either clearer or more blurry in certain spots. And I like to think of my father, who's not a writer, but as someone who is just invested in the oral tradition, as someone who in the reformatting of these stories is also moving through shifts in genre, right? Making up for what the memory no longer affords him by adding, which, I mean, I think part of this too is the understanding that memory is a privilege. And I don't think most people don't talk about memory as such, but I believe in memory as a privilege. Not just being able to hold on to memories, but also having a relationship with your memories that isn't wholly traumatic. And so my father, in grasping for whatever shifts in memory he experiences, has to move through genre in his oral storytelling. And so I come from a people who essentially are not beholden to genre, because to do that would require a certainty, or would require a focus that isn't always going to be present. And so for me, you know, like I came up playing in bands and writing for zines and being in like on a punk scene here. And there was no understanding of anything other than, you know, the thing about zines, I don't know who in the room here is like around my age, like early mid 30s, and who came up on a punk scene, particularly in the Midwest. But when there's like these interconnected scenes, and zines are the ways that the reporting happens, everyone loves a zine, but like motherfuckers on the scene don't want to write in a zine. You know, it was like, let's get this zine out. But then it was like, no, I want to write in it. But when you're that person who's tasked with doing the reporting, then it becomes, how many different ways can I tell the same story and hold people's attention, right? How many different ways can I deliver this information? I was just talking earlier today about how important the tactics we use to deliver information are, particularly if the information is information that people have heard before. And so when I consider these things, I feel like I owe it to myself and the people who feel compelled to listen to or read my work to not affix myself to genre at all, which is why in the Tribe book I was like, well, of course I can put these, I can switch to the epistolary form in the middle of this book, because I wanted to speak directly to these people. And if I want to do that, then I'm trying to remove the veil of, you know, I don't want to pretend when it comes to intimacy in my work, in my life either, but in my work in particular. I don't want to pretend. I don't want to, I want to cut directly to the heart of what I want to cut to. And sometimes genre as we know it, genre as the construct as we know it, doesn't do it in the way I want to do it. And so I think I owe it to myself to pursue whatever will get that job done. And sometimes that is a poem. Sometimes that is more long form work. Sometimes that is a poem nestled in the middle of the long form work. What I love about, I know I'm being very referential and bouncing around timeline wise, but I suppose that even that is a type of bending of genre. But what I love about Zora Neale Hurston, who's one of the first writers I ever read, well, you know, beyond children's book authors and all that, is that she was so good at writing, and was, I mean, needs to be said, and I know Black folks particularly probably know this, was villainized for this, but Zora Neale Hurston was writing in the language that her people spoke and in the ways that her people spoke. And when I take that approach to my work, when I'm trying to honor the language that I came up on, when I try to honor the storytellers that I came up loving, I don't really have, you know, it's foolish for me then to say, well, what genre should I do this in? I'm doing it in the genre of my people, which is multitudinous. So that is, sorry for that very long winding answer. And sorry that I now have to go. I'm sorry. I teach on every Tuesday. I teach here. Well, now here in my office, but in general. But thank you all for like letting me hang out. And I really love this book. And Regina, I'm such a big fan of your work for all the reasons Emily said, but particularly because I think as someone who grew up in the Midwest and looked at Southern rap first through the lens of Outkast, like Scarface and Outkast, it's just so exciting to continually see people putting an even closer, more nuanced and loving lens on those groups. So thank you so much for your work as well.
Thank you for being dope. I love your writing too. It's ridiculous. My husband has stole my copy of the Tribe book. It's really, really good. I'm just saying, thank you so much for your work. It's dope. Your words, everything.
Thank you, y'all. I appreciate it.
Have a good class. So, okay. I mean, Hanif kind of said it all, but I don't know, man. I think about, you know, the work that I do is counterintuitive to the academy. What I mean by that is like, you know what I'm saying? I have the traditional, you know, standards for what folks consider to be a scholar. You know what I mean? Like I got the PhD in English from a pretty decent PhD program. And I'm supposed to call myself an African-Americanist. You know what I mean? But it's like, none of that worked for me, man. None of it. You know what I'm saying? Like I did everything the academy told me I had to do to be successful, and none of that shit worked at all. You know what I mean? Like it was, I got my PhD in 2013. I didn't get a full-time job until 2015. You know what I mean? So it was like, it was time for me to really kind of sit back and renegotiate what it was I wanted to do with this PhD and all of this debt, first of all. And then the second part of it was, who am I writing for? You know what I'm saying? That became such a question about, who am I writing for? Am I writing for, you know, the academy, which is usually conservative, male, and white? Or am I writing for the folks, exactly what Hanif was saying? Or am I writing for the people that I used to sit on the porch with and have these conversations about music and life and culture? One of the stories that I always use, because I'm a storyteller, you know what I mean, is that I always used to kind of think about how I situate myself in this conversation is, I took Portia Maltby's Black Music Seminar at IU in the spring of 2007. I want to say it's spring of 07. It was me, Langston Conlon Wilkins, and Fredera Hadley, who's in the building. So, hey, Free, I see you. And we were there, and Fredera was like the OG graduate student. You know what I'm saying? She was like, this is how you get through. And we were having these conversations, and you know, in Maltby's class, we were talking about Black music, and we read race music, and we got these things, and we talked about hip hop. And you had a Southerner from Florida, Georgia, and Texas. And one of the questions we kept asking her was, where is the South in this conversation about contemporary music and hip hop? And Maltby always threw back to us, well, what are you gonna do about it? And at the time I was like, I ain't gonna do nothing because I'm trying to get about this class. It was the best B I ever made. You know what I'm saying? But then couldn't find a job, couldn't find all these things. And I just finally just reached this fuck it stage where I was like, you know what, fuck it, I'm gonna do what I want. I'm gonna, you know, folks are talking about the 20th anniversary of Nas's Illmatic. That's dope. But I'm from Albany, Georgia. You know what I mean? Nobody was bumping Nas's Illmatic. Everybody was talking about Outkast. And I was like, oh, let's have this conversation about Outkast. You know what I'm saying? And all of these things. So I started having these conversations with folks. You know, we had this conversation. I was like, you know, so that led to the early rumblings for Chronicle and Stankonia. You know what I'm saying? And then I started to get a little bit of attention on that, and that's cool. But the question still remained, who are you writing for? So then I was like, starting to think about, what did I want my book to do? And if you have conversations about the South, they're usually white centered. And I'm like, as a Southerner, I don't really care what white folks think about me as a Black Southerner, like being completely honest, you know what I'm saying? And on top of that, white Southerner can't tell me what Black Southernness means. And that's exactly what happens in Southern studies, and folks, you know, getting their feelings about that. But it's true, Southern studies is hella white and it's hella boring. And you're just kind of like, okay, but how are you gonna tell me that somebody like Jesmyn Ward, for example, is the next William Faulkner, but you can't put her in conversation with the Zora Neale Hurstons, with, you know, all of these folks, especially coming from Mississippi, that has a rich literary heritage. You know what I'm saying? I'm like, why do that? And then on top of that, Jesmyn Ward is using Southern hip hop lyrics to open her work, from Pastor Troy to Outkast to, you know what I mean? And I'm like, so what's up with that? And why is that not being discussed? So ultimately, that's the question that grounds it. In addition to everything that Hanif said about genre, it just works. And I think it works because that's how I'm invested in it. And to be able to see myself in the conversations that I've been blocked out of for so long, I think is really important to how we have these types of conversations about culture and music, especially the types of conversations we're having now. You know what I'm saying? And making room for other folks who might not have those same, you know, afforded privileges of being traditionally trained as an academic, and making space like, you know what, I might not have this language, I might not have this particular type of legibility, but that doesn't make my criticism of the culture that I'm immersed in no less relevant. Yeah. So all of that, my pageant answer.
Yeah, it's amazing. And so, I mean, in some ways, it's both a gesture back and a gesture forward. It's a gesture back to the way that Black writers, I mean, at least we can go back to Du Bois, we can go back to Anna Julia Cooper, we can go back as far as we really can go back, have used myriad forms and genres, you know, to get the work done, right? And to speak to myriad audiences. And it's also a gesture forward to people coming through these doors after you to say, like, you can do this, and you can do this in the way that works best for you to say what you need to say, addressing who you need to address. Yeah.
I think especially in literary studies, like I think what's happening now is very refreshing, is that folks who say they're literary scholars are moving away from those traditional forms of what literary analysis means, what textual analysis means. So for me, what stood out in the book is using music as a text, but being able to negotiate not only the literary significance of it, you know, because folks, when you think about literary analysis of music, folks automatically go to like lyrics. You know what I'm saying? And I'm like, yeah, that's part of it, but there's a larger part that you need to think through. So in the same way that poets think about spacing and they think about the whiteness on the page, it's the same way that, you know, we're thinking about what does this accompaniment mean? You know what I mean? Like if you have this falsetto, what type of accompaniment in the background do you have to amplify that falsetto? Because that's like that's what we want to talk about. Right? Instead of because it gets boring too. You know what I'm saying? Like it gets boring to just be like, oh, I study music, but all I do is look at the lyrics. And I'm like, boo, you missing like half the story, half the narrative. The narrative is more complicated than the words. And I think to analyze something like soul or hip hop, you have to recognize that it's more than the lyrics. Because what I tell my students is the lyrics tell you what the MC wants to tell you about a story. The producer's story and intention is told in the sounds behind that, or the non-musical cues, which is what I was going to ask you is, what do you think are the touchstone non-musical cues of soul music that might be useful in understanding how you're theorizing the music itself? It's like you talk about a little bit about the lyricism, you talk a little bit about the falsetto, but that's the one thing that was in the back of my mind is the non-musical cues, the grunting, the wail, what role does that play in how you're thinking about remembering soul in the right way and applying it to the research that you're doing?
Yeah, that's so good. So first of all, just quickly about reading Black music in terms of content, which is part of what we're talking about when we're talking about lyrics as opposed to form. Mm-hmm. That's a problem, right? It's the desire for Black music to be simple, to have an easily, readily available, digestible message. Even if that message is like, you know, a protest message, it's easier to say, okay, I know what that's about, right? And moving on, right? As Hanif was saying. Than to say, like, how does this work? Like, what is the formal and theoretical intervention and innovation that's happening within the music? And so that's why, that's what's at stake politically in focusing not just on what the lyrics are saying, but what the musicians and, you know, instrumentalist singers and others, arrangers are actually doing. The other question was about, oh, right, the non-musical kind of cues. I mean, I love that question because it relates back to Hurston. I think of Hurston as like one of the primary theorists of these kinds of non-musical modes of Black expression. And her essay, Characteristics of Negro Expression. No, it's in Spirituals and Neo-Spirituals, where she is talking about, just quickly, she's talking about the spirituals, and she says, you know, people will often say of a preacher, he's got a good straining voice. Mm-hmm. And you know, when I teach that to my students, it's to suggest that the very strain in the voice suggests a counter narrative to or response to a kind of, you know, Western tradition wherein the sound is supposed to seem as though it's being emitted from a vessel that's not an actual body, right? Like this is embodied work, and it's Sparrow Griffin writes in an essay, you know, it's music that achieves transcendence precisely through bodily work, and that's the grunts, and that's, you know, that's Nina Simone and Be My Husband, and all of the like stretching and straining and working within and around the confines of that song that she's doing. So those moves have their own meaning. And the Griffin essay, by the way, is When Melindy Sings, for people who are curious. It's a landmark essay about Black musicality. So
hey guys, I should probably jump in for a quick second and open the floor to some Q&A, just because we're about 50 minutes in, which isn't to shut down Gina, you from participating in the Q&A as well. But we do have
some moderator job, Eric. It's cool.
So we got questions from Antonia first, then Anne, then Jen, then Barry. That should probably take us for quite a while. So Antonia, you start us off.
Sure. Thank you so much, Emily, for this brief about your book. The question I raised was about the contribution of focusing on Black soul singers, who are women in particular, and thinking about why those particular singers have been overlooked, Black female soul singers. And I started thinking about this idea of Black musical genius and how that is gendered. And thinking that only Aretha Franklin is recognized as a Black female soul singing genius. And so the attraction towards genius in a particular art form, and the inability to recognize Black women as genius and soul. That's, thinking about why women have been overlooked.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that. That's absolutely right. The way that genius has been not only race, but also gendered. Absolutely. And the work, I mean, how much work I feel like and how much time it took for some to acknowledge even Aretha as a genius, and the work that it takes still to say that Black women influence the work of men, right? That we tend to think about it the other way around, or some people tend to think about it kind of the other way around. But to say like Aretha Franklin was really important to Donny Hathaway, right? That there are things that she's doing that he's learning from. So people, to see Black women as progenitors, as influences. It was really important, and that includes the political turn that soul music takes, which is often credited to people like Curtis Mayfield or Sam Cooke singing "Change Is Gonna Come," and those people are important, but people don't often think about Nina Simone as one of the first to sing "Mississippi Goddamn," one of the first to sing a song like for women, and to kind of do that politicizing work even before some of the important male figures who are going to come after her. So yeah, thank you.
And I just want to throw in Roberta Flack as so generative, and Roberta Flack as someone who I would say is understudied, as someone who Donny Hathaway and all these other folks who are coming from the Roberta Flack School of Music.
Thank you.
Well, I guess Roberta Flack takes us naturally into Anne. So Anne, you had a question? Perhaps we've lost Anne.
Hi, sorry. That was kind of an insider comment. I did write a very big piece on Roberta Flack, exactly trying to reclaim her at the center of the conversation earlier this year. My question, Emily, has to do with, well, it was inspired by what Hanif was saying about his father. And I thought that was really interesting and beautiful to talk about those same four stories and how kind of the reinforcement through personal communication, which is also how you learn songs oftentimes. And I was curious about your thoughts on kind of the figure of the father and soul. There are so many songs about fathers and soul, the figure of the mother and soul, the idea of parental transmission as a form of cultural transmission. Whereas at the same time, I think of soul especially as it moves into out of the civil rights era, I guess, or whatever, not that we're ever out of that era, into the 70s, 80s, 90s, as also like, it's all about reinventing yourself through a kind of urbanism that might have to do with moving away from parental transmissions. So I wondered about that idea of the parental element in soul, both as a trope and just cultural transmission in that way.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I have to admit, I don't have anything really like that interesting to say about it beyond what you said. I mean, I guess I would amplify your point that to think about the parental figures. I mean, it's interesting, right? Because it helps us think about a genre, or like the kind of the site of Motown as the kind of the sound of young America, as also a sound of, what does it mean to be young? I mean, to be young is not to be old, right? And so there's like necessarily a kind of tension or not necessarily even tension or conflict, but there's like an awareness of like what it is to be young, the sound of youth, that you only maintain for so long. And so I don't know, but I like the idea of thinking about that question of sort of legacy and in transmission, and what you kind of take with you and what you try to leave behind. So, I mean, Aretha is an easy example of this, right? Like she of the great father figure who leaves the church largely with his blessing and is able to do that in some ways because she has his blessing, that it isn't quite as vexed a transition for her as it is, I think, for Marvin Gaye, for instance. or Sam Cooke, maybe even. And so, you know, what it means for her to, I mean, I love that moment in the Amazing Grace documentary because she's there, her dad is there, Claire, you know, everybody's like there, right? James Cleveland is there. But the moment where she like really kind of takes the microphone, and those of you who haven't seen it, you know, we'll see it. And she's really leading the call and response. She kind of turns toward the choir and is singing a call and response with them. It seems like this beautiful moment of her being like sort of seizing that stage and that traditionally male platform, patriarchal platform, to say like, this is a music that is indebted to those who came before me, but it's also one that I'm carrying forward myself in their honor, you know.
I think our next, oh, sorry. Did you want to follow up, Anne? Okay, I think our next question comes from Jen Lena. Jen?
Hi, yeah, thanks. Sorry, it just took me a minute to find the unmute. Thank you all for this amazing conversation. My question for Emily, and I'll admit that I read the chapter that was shared in advance, and I want to share some of her writing. My question is about the relationship between music as labor and your choice to treat soul as more than a genre. So for example, you write in the introduction that, quote, soul's recuperative logic helps explain how, for instance, James Brown, the self-designated soul brother #1, made the concept of being the hardest working man in show business not a source of frustration or shame, but as a badge of honor. So it seems to me, end quote. So it seems to me that genres are largely about containing artists into categories that capital record companies think that they can make money off of. Can your broader definition of soul as a logic help us to revalue the labor, the work of musicians?
Maybe. I mean, I guess I hadn't really put them together in quite that way, Jen, honestly, but I mean, I guess I just think more methodologically that it's important for us to focus on the material conditions that, you know, produce Black music. Again, because it has historically been framed as a music that is kind of mystical and magical and, you know, sort of unmoored from the everyday realities, even as it is overdetermined by them, right? Is a kind of commonplace, I think, methodology for people who are approaching the music from outside of a Black studies context. But I guess, yeah, I definitely want to think about soul as moving beyond genre, which is one reason why I take the soul practices that I distill in the different chapters into the present moment. So for instance, you know, thinking about adlibs in the work of Prince, right? Somebody who I choose not at random because like I love Prince, like everybody loves Prince, but because he was so specific about fashioning himself in line with the greats of kind of funk and soul. And so thinking about how these practices carry, but nevertheless, how those soul practices, I call them, how they carry, but also how they do acquire different meanings. So I think they carry that valence of kind of group encouragement, as Gail Wilde, I think, calls it Black encouragement, and this sense of resilience that I associate with soul. But they also, read in a different context, it's important, and this is something that I didn't touch on earlier, but to acknowledge the ways in which in a post-soul, kind of post-revolutionary neoliberal moment, the idea of resilience becomes quite problematic, right? And so those practices, I think, tend to work against a moment of this sort of individualizing cultural impulse that says, you know, if you are in trouble, it's your own fault, you're not resilient enough. And just trying to kind of balance that sense of continuity with an awareness that these practices have to mean something a little bit different in the new context. And finally, Solange is a good example of that. Seat at the Table, I think, that uses falsetto to express not only the possibilities and joy that we hear in a Minnie Riperton, but also the kind of world weariness that she has discussed in interviews, including with Daphne Brooks, about that album. So that's an example of how a soul practice carries beyond the genre and beyond the moment, but does mean something slightly different.
This is, I think, related, but I'll throw it over to him as well. Barry Shank, you out there?
There we go. Yeah, it's a question directly about your use of the word logic. So it follows up on Jen's question really nicely. And I've only read the introduction, so you might get into this in more depth in the rest of the book. But but I like the concept of logic at an intuitive level. It makes a lot of sense intuitively, but I want to know how strictly you mean logic, because logic as a word to me seems to have a kind of rigidity, you know, a kind of formal structure, a kind of linked, almost not quite mechanical, but a kind of direct set of links, which I don't think is what you mean. I don't think that's what you mean. I think you mean something more fluid, something more like an underlying set of similarities. But I also don't think you mean homology, which is the other word that we've often used to mean the same kind of thing, right? To a kind of structural similarity. And I don't think that's what you mean at all. And I really get the sense that what you're talking about is something that's at a deeper affective level. So if you could sort of say more about why you chose the word logic and not some kind of version of the affect conversation. That's what I'd like to hear you talk about.
Right, thank you. Sorry, I wasn't muted after all. That's a great question. And I use the term logic in part thanks to Wanima Lubiano, who talks about Black nationalism as a cultural logic that pervades Black culture beyond the end of sort of Black power movement proper, right? Thinking about how, you know, by other names, the logic of Black nationalism continues. And in some ways for Lubiano, that is, it's not something to be celebrated necessarily, but it's something that she carefully assesses. So soul as a cultural logic, again, I think about it in terms of a kind of habit of thought that is a very old habit of thought that says, from the margins, we're able to do something different and something better than we would have been able to do had we been at the center. This is Baldwin saying, Black people have always understood white people better because we need to understand for purposes of survival. Or, you know, Du Bois talking about the gift of second sight that's made available for those, you know, within the veil. And it's an old kind of Baptist concept as well. I mean, it's Judeo-Christian in kind of its broadest sense. The idea that suffering has a payoff, right? The idea that you can look back on how you got over and see that as proof, as evidence of God's grace that you will get over again, right? It's another way, it's again, just that same logic of I've come through something and I've gotten something, right? Through that. Soul secularizes that logic to a certain extent and certainly collectivizes that logic. And so just as, you know, soul practices move certain kinds of gospel techniques out of the church and onto secular stages, I'm suggesting that the broader cultural discourse or logic of soul is taking that religious idea of the redemptive nature of suffering and it's moving it into this kind of secular or politicized terrain. Does that make more sense?
Yes. And you reminded me that you do cover a lot of that in the introduction. And I think that I understand the way the thinking works. I understand the way you've explained it. And I appreciate the reference to Lubiano too, because I'd forgotten about how great her stuff is, and I haven't read her in a long time. And also, I also like the insistence on the modifier cultural, because cultural logic then sort of softens the word itself, or not really, you know, not in terms of its intellectual rigor, but in terms of its otherwise logic has this kind of set of harsh edges, and you don't mean harsh edges. I think you mean the kind of fluidity that maybe a Raymond Williams would have talked about too, if he would have used the word cultural logic. So that kind of set of habits, you talk about historical knowledge and the ability to look backwards and forwards at the same time. And I think that's all part of what you mean by a logic as something that survives various kinds of historical crises and modes of survival and links them together, right?
Exactly. I mean, to say soul is a way of reading oneself in a relationship to other people.
Yeah.
Who also have soul, right? And have earned that. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, Emily, thank you so much for a terrific hour. I encourage everyone to check out this brand new off the presses book. So brand new, it's barely even, you know, it's just starting to resonate through our world. So congratulations. And I should point out one more time for next week that we'll be looking at Maria Sherman's work, Larger Than Life, A History of Boy Bands from NKOTB to BTS. She'll be joining us from Australia. And thanks to everyone for participating today, and hopefully we'll see you next week. All right? Thanks, everybody.